Hello, good morning, and welcome everyone to today's session. Uh, it's a Q&A conversation on the AI and the future of human resources. My name's Mike Pino, and I'm happy to be the host here with XED. Today's webinar is going to introduce topics and faculty of Cornell CHR Leadership Program. The next cohort of the program begins soon, and it's a 6-month executive education program where you have more time to dive deep into advanced HR strategies alongside world-class Cornell faculty. Besides access to important topics and exceptional faculty, you'll also enjoy 1 year of access to Cornell's exclusive online library of learning materials covering everything from leadership and innovation to supply chain and finance. It has peer coaching. There are 3 big tiers to just really go through this. Over 6 months, you'll be spending time with senior executives with an average experience of 21 years coming from the Middle East, Latin America, Asia, Africa, the Far East. Starts on the 8th of April with 16 live interactive sessions delivered at 8 a.m. Eastern and with peer coaching and feedback. Now, today's session, because we got so many questions from people in the audience, we decided to revert the session and spend more time answering questions because this seems to be a topic that everyone wants to talk about. And in today's session, it's important if you actually want to ask questions, if something comes up in answering a question, you want to ask a question, please make sure you do using the tools on the right-hand side of your screen. It's my distinct pleasure to introduce our esteemed guest, Professor Seth Litwin from Cornell University's School of Industrial and Labor Relations. Professor Litwin is a renowned scholar and thought leader at the intersection of labor relations, technology, and the future of work. Professor Litwin explores how technology has been changing and enhancing various HR practices, including talent acquisition, employee engagement, and performance management. His work emphasizes the critical role that AI plays in modernizing HR functions, enabling organizations to make data-driven decisions that improve workforce efficiency and satisfaction, especially in highly regulated industries like healthcare. In addition to his research that has significantly contributed to our understanding of how technology can reshape the workplace, Professor Litwin is actively involved in research and consulting on the ethical implications of AI in the workplace, advocating for responsible and inclusive practices that benefit both employees and employers. We're very incredibly fortunate to have him join us today and share his insights and perspectives on these critical topics. Please join me in welcoming Professor Seth Litwin. Professor, would you like to introduce yourself to the audience?
Yes, thank you so much for that introduction, Mike. I really appreciate it. As Mike said, I'm Seth Litwin. I am an associate professor of industrial and labor relations here at Cornell University. Although I should be honest, it looks like I'm in my office at Cornell University, but I'm actually in a hotel room right now in Washington, D.C. because I'm speaking at a conference on AI and public policy, which may come up in the course of our Q&A. So I'd be happy to chat about that if it does.
Well, with that in mind, I'd like to actually tee off to the first question that we actually received. Even before the session began, we received 3 questions from people as they registered. The first question we got was from Dominic, and he asked, AI is changing how HR works, but how can companies make sure it's fair and it doesn't have biases, especially when hiring and reviewing employees?
So I think particularly in hiring and in employee reviews, I think there are a bunch of strategic steps that a company can take. So here are a couple ways to think about that. First of all, I really think companies want to implement fairness-aware AI systems. So they should use AI algorithms that are actually designed to detect and mitigate biases. And that's going to include employing fairness-aware algorithms and really regularly auditing the AI systems so that you can identify and rectify any biases as they emerge, and they will. Managers can learn all about those kinds of technologies and those strategies in programs like this one. And so I think that's part of what would enable them to really implement these strategies effectively, implement AI effectively within their organizations. I also think it's important that they diversify their training data. AI systems have inherent biases in their training data. We know that. And so to ensure that the data are diverse and representative is really crucial. There's skills that managers can develop to assess and actually improve the quality of training data, which is going to reduce the likelihood of those sorts of biases. And that's going to involve understanding at some level data pre-processing techniques and even the importance of diverse data sets. And then finally, we are always going to need humans in the loop. AI can't ever make, should never make final decisions without human oversight. And I think managers can benefit from programs like our CHRO program where they actually learn how to implement some of these transparent AI processes, make sure that processes are explainable and that they can explain them, that the processes are subject to human review. And that's going to include probably disclosing AI use to candidates and actually providing options to them for even opting out of some of the automated screenings. Again, these are all topics that we'll get into in the program.
And that's actually these are really good points. A lot of these are very meaty issues, and some of them are very difficult to actually dig into. Explainability is actually very hard for a lot of people even to understand as a concept, let alone what are some of the fair ways that you can do it. And it sounds like what you're advocating for is really start first by actually understanding, then set policy, make sure you set processes in motion, and make sure to actually put this in place. The second question that came in
Yeah.
is what new skills do HR people need to learn to work with AI, and how can companies help them learn those skills? And this comes from Anisha, and this is another one of those kinds of questions where in my travels and in the conversations I have, we hear this question an awful lot. People feel very anxious about there's just so much changing, and it feels like it's changing daily, if not weekly.
There's a lot of onus on HR folks in particular. We know that finance is never going to learn the HR function. Unfortunately, the HR function doesn't really have that luxury. Same thing with technical folks. So I think that the first thing that HR professionals are really going to need is a basic understanding of the technologies themselves, including machine learning and deep learning, and some data literacy skills so they can actually, interpret and analyze data effectively. Companies can provide some training programs that focus on these technical aspects, but I think a lot of that is really kind of trying to find the knowledge on your own and developing it. And our executive education course is actually going to get into some of the ways that you can identify these learning sources. Our course is not super technical, so we're not going to get into necessarily the technical aspects of it, although honestly, we'll probably touch on them a bit, but it's more being able to find these resources on your own later so that when you know that you need to be an expert in, say, reinforcement learning, you can go and track that down. We also need HR folks to be experts in strategy and change management. That's a little bit more naturally in their wheelhouse. But we want folks to think strategically more so than just functionally, and to actually integrate change management into their thinking about AI and into AI processes more smoothly. Again, there'll be other people in the organization that know the technology really well. There are unlikely to be people that know the change management pieces as well as you do. And so that's why it's important, again, that you be able to sort of integrate the technical knowledge into the change management knowledge. But you'll need to be able to communicate the benefits of AI. You'll need to, of course, manage resistance, and then also ensure some of the ethical issues that we talked about with respect to Dominic's question. So I think there are ways that companies can support that, but I think that you as HR leaders will probably need to really be the captains or the pilots in that process. And then finally, you'll need to be able to sort of upskill and reskill not just yourselves, but have some sense of how you'll need to do that to fill the AI gaps in your companies. Again, that's an effort that you'll lead. And so certainly you need to fill your own AI gaps, but then you need to kind of figure out how to fill the AI gaps for those in your company. And those are also topics that we'll get into in the program.
And this is fabulous. So it's like you have to recognize the awareness level of where the organization is. You also have to recognize that this conversation is happening with people that may not actually have the same terms or the same language, and being able to help actually bridge that gap or help improve that is going to help improve the performance of the organization as a whole. Because a lot of times,
yeah.
Go
Oh,
ahead.
no, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. No, I just think in so many ways that's what HR people have to do. I mean, it's an expensive ticket to be an HR person, right? Because aside from being the only person that understands the quote unquote soft challenges in an organization, you also have to understand enough of these other functions that you can sit at the table and have real conversations with those folks. And again, none of them are going to do it. The technical people, the accountants, the finance people, they don't feel like they need to know a little bit of HR. Unfortunately, we need to know a little bit of everything, which honestly is what makes this kind of interesting and what makes the challenge sort of worth it. But I do think that the heavy burden is on us, which is why we need programs like this one.
I really appreciate that, Professor. And so what you're also advocating for is not just that awareness level, but it's also this sort of wisdom that, how do you take the insights and the experience of things you've had before? How do you sharpen it with programs like this to be able to talk to things and to be able to present things in that way? That's a really important insight. We had
Absolutely.
about 4 questions that have come in, but there's one more that came in before, so I'm gonna tee that one up, and then I'm gonna start taking the ones that are actually queuing up here
Yeah.
in the Q&A section. Besides what we see AI doing in HR now, and what people are actually probably referring to as a lot of the automation tools that exist in tracking candidates and talent acquisition and being able to do some basic stuff on HR policy and making a chatbot that's a little bit more intelligent. Um,
Mhm.
Besides those things that people are actually using inside AI, what else is actually happening as a futurist of work and as someone who spends a lot of time thinking about the future of work? How do you think that companies um, will have to actually address these big changes that are on the horizon with AI and what they can actually do for HR? And how can companies get ready for those changes? So this came from Zayed.
Yeah, it's a big one. Yeah, so AI is definitely poised to bring some pretty transformative changes to the workplace, even beyond its current applications in HR, which I think we're still trying to kind of wrap our heads around. There are a bunch of ways that companies can prepare for these shifts. Some of it is going to sound pretty straightforward. Strategic planning, skill development, I already talked about, organizational adaptability. But I think there are a few kind of more specific tasks to think about. One is kind of workplace transformation and job redesign. AI is going to automate all sorts of routine tasks. It's going to allow employees ideally to focus on strategic, creative, interpersonal kinds of work. And that shift is going to require a redesign of a lot of roles to actually emphasize multi-skilled capabilities, worker adaptability. So managers can learn through, again, programs like our CHRO program, how to restructure job roles, how to create more agile team structures, how to ensure that AI tools really do actually complement rather than replace human efforts, which is a big area of concern for me. And it's one of the reasons I'm here at this policy conference. I talked about upskilling and reskilling initiatives. I think AI is going to transform job requirements. So companies are going to have to invest in continuous learning programs in order to prepare employees for new roles. Once again, to CHROs and aspiring CHROs, you're going to be the captains or the pilots of those programs. That's going to include programs to develop new skills. So, data analysis, AI tool usage, but also human-centric skills that are much harder to teach, particularly people outside of kind of a people management function, critical thinking, collaboration. And CHROs are really going to need to lead those kinds of initiatives, again, by identifying skill gaps. And I think there are ways to sort of use AI-powered analytics to actually implement targeted training programs. Uh, so increasingly, I'm just suggesting people, think to use AI in as many ways as possible. It's there now, so you might as well. And then finally, and this may be the hardest part, but I think that it's going to fall upon CHROs to actually build an ethical AI framework in their organizations. The integration of AI raises all kinds of concerns that we've already talked about, actually, about bias and data privacy and transparency. And companies are going to need to establish frameworks to actually ensure ethical AI use is aligned with their organizational values. Managers can take all kinds of proactive roles to do that. Part of that's going to be about learning how to monitor AI systems for fairness, involving diverse stakeholders in decision-making, maintaining open communication with employees about AI's impact. All of which is really easy for me to say, but often I think it's going to make the CHRO it's going to often make the CHRO the skunk at the picnic, which is sadly a role that CHROs are already used to having to fill, right? But you're also uniquely equipped to kind of deal with that, right? Like, how do I be the person in the room that reminds people sometimes that, wait, we need to slow down, right? We're not necessarily allowed to collect that information, or we need to think about how we're going to use that information, right? Those are the challenges of being a CHRO. As I said, it's an expensive ticket. Right. It'd be much easier to be in finance.
Although that's actually, from the point of view of where AI is actually making the massive strides, a lot of the automation and a lot of the early RPA and automation was in the finance function, believe it or not. And so a
Oh, yeah.
lot of the initial work that actually started to hit was actually in the finance function. That you touched upon something. We've got two questions here, so I'm gonna combine the two questions. One was from Yogesh. You touched upon how the CHRO plays a really interesting role here to help actually organizations think about data protection and privacy in this light. What are some of the things that AI professionals should do, or AI professionals? What are some of the things that HR professionals should be thinking about with respect to data protection and privacy?
It's a good question. I mean, I think there are a bunch of ways, that AI can enhance our day-to-day work and improve efficiency, and also even elevate the employee experience. But I do think that there's sort of a bunch of things to keep in mind. One, it's gonna automate some routine tasks, and that's a good thing. Things like resume screening and candidate screening and data analysis. And it's going to free people up to sort of focus on a bunch of other things. That's a good thing, but we also really need to think about data-driven decision making and how it is that we can make sure that it enhances our decision making, and that it doesn't sort of step in and sort of make our decisions for us without our really questioning them. So we can use this insight. We can think about how it's going to help recruitment and workforce planning. It's going to help us analyze reams of data quickly, things that we weren't able to do before, so we can identify trends. But I will say and this is actually something that's come up in this conference where I'm right now. I'm particularly concerned about agentic AI, which is sort of the next step in this process, because we keep talking about how important it is for folks like CHROs to be the humans in the loop, right? To never accept the output from, say, a large language model and just copy and paste it and walk away, right, without reading it. And that's important. I think most CHROs recognize that. The problem is, by construction, agentic AI takes the output from something like a large language model and immediately takes the next steps. And so if it's really acting agentically, it's not clear to me exactly where humans are in the loop, right? And so I think, again, it's going to be up to CHROs, particularly from their seat at the strategy table, to remind folks, listen, this is super efficient, right? But we need to make sure that there's still people at some point stepping into this process and examining it. It's okay, for example, not to necessarily have a human in the loop for every single individual customer chat interaction, right? Because the cost of most of those mistakes won't be too large, right? I mean, obviously, you don't want to lose a customer, but nobody's going to die. Nobody's going to lose a job, right? At worst, you're going to give someone an answer that doesn't make sense, and you're hopefully going to have an opportunity for them to declare that and then speak to a human. But I do think with so many HR-related functions, right, to let those operate automatically, we're going to have to be really careful, which means agentic AI, I think in particular, is going to be the next really big challenge on many of these fronts. Fronts for privacy, fronts for making sure that we're implementing these technologies fairly. And at the moment, I think that's in part because agentic AI isn't here in the same way that LLMs are. I think that we just haven't thought about it in the same way. Not yet.
Well, I mean, and they're coming though, and this is the thing that you actually can start to see. Salesforce is already putting out some of these
Oh
kinds
yeah,
of capabilities, and so the fact that it's here and it's soon, not being aware enough of the issues behind agentic AI and the frameworks, and how do you really think through this as an HR professional? That's why this kind of program is really important. It makes a good degree of sense. Another question came in that's a little bit more focused or tailored around the pharma industry. I'm going to read the question as it is, and then I'm going to add another component part to it because we had a couple of
okay.
other questions come in. So I just want to try to tee them all up together. So a lot of AI is actually used in drug development in pharma. And there's a lot of stuff that people are actually applying based on the research and based on using some of this in the analysis. There are concerns about it, but some of the biggest gains that we've had recently in the last few years have been in the application of large language models to rip through reams of scientific data to
Yeah.
understand things. What are some of the play? Are there is there something in here that we actually obviously there's a whole component part in the pharma industry that you're paying attention to, but is there also something that HR has to be paying attention to as well? Because obviously, pharma has its quality control and has other things. But where does HR play in this? Because there's probably a piece here. That's the question.
Yeah. So it's interesting at this conference I'm attending right now. Um, the topic came up of how will AI impact scientific discovery, and are we accounting for that in a couple different ways? Are we accounting for that in sort of productivity measures? I don't consider
That's an
myself especially
interesting one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't consider myself especially knowledgeable about the pharmaceutical industry, but I did read some of the write-ups around in the fall when the Nobel Prizes were announced. And there were two that had pretty close AI focus. One of which I think was it was chemistry or physiology, where they had used AI to test protein sequences, basically. And it was fascinating to me because basically instead of testing, dozens per month, they could basically do hundreds of thousands per day, and then predict the likely outcome of the different sequences. Uh, I guess part of what comes up in this situation is whether or not your most highly skilled professional employees, in this case, we're talking about PhD scientists, still feel that they have autonomy in their labs. And this actually is going to manifest itself in other sectors too. Not everybody has workplaces that are filled with PhD scientists, but you do have workplaces that are filled with highly skilled, highly educated folks with graduate degrees who want to feel that the technology really is augmenting their work and that it isn't stepping in and doing what they used to do or doing what they used to do better, right? So it's really important in those situations that CHROs and others in the HR kind of functional hierarchy work with those people to make sure that the AI that is in place to serve them, that they are not working for the technology, but that the technology is working for them. And we have to remind ourselves over and over again, something that I'm sure you've heard with respect to other technologies before this, the technology is a tool. The technology is a tool. And so you don't ever want those people to feel like they are tools of the technology. And that's going to be about talking to them. They know, right? They're the people with both the tacit and the explicit knowledge to tell us how it is that these technologies can benefit them. And so as HR folks, we're going to need to listen to them. And my guess is, on average, we're pretty good at doing that, but it is then about taking that information and relaying it back to the others in the organization, right? And to say, like, we know how this technology can help us. And so we need you to make those kinds of investments in those kinds of purchases and procurements.
So you answered quite a few questions that have actually popped in here. So I'm not going to read the questions about what should HR professionals really care about with AI, or what are the biggest misconceptions, or what are the places where we need to play. But there's one here that came in that's definitely someone actually picked up on your future of work research and asked, how do you see HR evolving in the future of work? And they're not even talking about AI. They're just talking about where is HR going with this evolution that we're watching in front of us? And what has your research uncovered about this evolution?
I think it's good that they're asking that question because, of course, this is a CHRO program, and everywhere I go now, everybody is talking about AI. That's what everybody wants to talk about. But of course, the program does cover non-AI topics as well. Although my guess is honestly, almost every session is going to end up in some way speaking to AI. That's just the way the world is right now. Um, so I think increasingly, I think a few different things. Technology's been great for a long time at automating what we think of as routine tasks. Um, Algorithms, and I mean old school algorithms, not AI infused algorithms. Algorithms for a long time have been really great at assuming tasks that were very routine and very proceduralizable. That's a fancy word that academics use. Um, and then coming up with an answer. And so for years, people like to talk about, oh, high skilled people will be fine, low skilled people will be fine. And then folks like me stepped in and said, actually, that's not quite the distinction because we can think of high skill jobs that are actually quite routine. There's a lot of work that accountants do that's very routine, ergo in the US, TurboTax, right?
Mhm.
And I know that's less popular in other parts of the world, but so much of what accountants do, despite the fact that we think of them as high skilled and they were always and remain highly paid, right? Like a lot of that's routinizable, right? Or proceduralizable. Likewise, on the low skill end, the example was always what we call janitors or custodians. We don't think of them as very high skill people, but those jobs were not automatable. The people that cleaned offices and schools, they were going to have jobs for a while. So we like to point out the high skill, low skill thing actually is not a great distinction. It's about routinizability. Likewise, the physical versus cognitive thing, not a great distinction either, because a lot of physical tasks were hard to routinize. AI has changed all of that, right? And so now there are all kinds of tasks that like may not necessarily be routine, but sure seem automatable, right? And so now we are working our way up the skill ladder and we are working our way up the cognitive ladder. And so it does seem like there are many, many more jobs that could be affected, including jobs that folks said, well, those jobs will never be affected, right? And a lot of those are high status jobs and high skill jobs. And I think that's going to be one of the next really big challenges for HR folks. The other one, and it's coming slowly, but it's sort of along the lines of the agentic AI challenge that I just raised. And that is we're taking the knowledge that's embedded in AI and we're actually embedding it in physical technology. So for a long time now, we've had factory robots. And for a shorter time now, we've had AI and large language models. But what happens when you can actually give AI or a large language model a physical embodiment? In other words, infusing robots with AI. Like, again, like we have that now. They haven't diffused in a big way. But actually giving robots that physical embodiment, I think that, and when I say robots, I don't necessarily mean, humanoid robots, so you don't have to picture something from the movies. But I think that that's going to create all sorts of challenges that are going to be organizational and are going to be people related. And so people are going to turn to the CHRO and be like, okay, tell us, right? And those are the questions that, you're all going to need to be able to answer.
It sounds like on the horizon, we have an awful lot of change ahead of us. And the change that's ahead of us are going to be thorny issues about what really is human in the loop, especially as we start to go down these paths where with agentic frameworks, where you can start to routinize a lot of things that you don't think are routinizable. Like if you imagine that a large language model is your espresso machine and your barista is an agent who
Yes.
operates the
Yes.
espresso machine, right?
It's a good
Well,
way to think about that. Yeah.
uh, um, if you think about the cafe, there are a lot of things that happen in the cafe that the barista may do, but if all the barista knows how to do is operate the espresso machine, then all you get from the agent is the espresso machine. So there's parts of this that's going to be HR, and there are parts of this that are going to be operations, and there's going to be a lot of confusion on how to actually manage this. But there's going to be an awful lot of considerations we're going to have. And I think the caution that I don't think people heard, and I want to underline, is the high status jobs
Yes.
is actually
Yes.
a big one that people probably should be hearing, because this one's going to create a lot of challenges. Because if you think about the high level EVP, AVP, SVP kind of roles, some of that is routinizable as well. And that's
Yes.
creating a problem because they have a lot of power in the organization. So how does this play out?
Yeah.
So this will be the last question. I want to be very thoughtful of our time, but what would you say as a thought to really encourage people as they start to consider their role in this new world and thinking about actually raising their awareness and getting ready to take this on? What would be one thing that you would really encourage them to, hey, not besides getting aware, what else would you say is a really critical thing to do?
I think increasingly, I think the single most important thing to do is to recognize that the technology does not determine destiny. Not for you, not for the organizations you work in, and if I want to be really grandiose, not for society in general. I think being a technological determinist, someone who just assumes the technology is going to push us where it pushes us, I think that's especially problematic in HR. Aside from the fact that I think being a technological determinist makes us all sort of feel like we're out of control, and that's probably not pleasant for our daily lives. Being in HR, you're actually in a position to determine whether or not technology makes folks' lives better, or just intensifies their work or displaces them altogether. And so I would say, remember that you really have an opportunity to control the direction that the technology takes yourself and others. And as a result, you really have a way to actually kind of improve the world, which I know sounds like really big language. But I do think in HR, we often get kind of lost in the day-to-day kind of functionality of keeping the trains running, which of course you have to do. But I'd say don't lose sight of the bigger picture. One of the questions that folks love to ask me, not necessarily in these settings, but like literally like when I'm home at family events, people, they're like, so tell us how many jobs are going to be affected. It's like, well, literally every single job is going to be, affected. How many jobs are going to be displaced? I don't know. I try to punt on that one. But how many jobs will be affected? It's hard for me to think of that many jobs that won't be affected. I mean, I sometimes go to AI now when I need, brainstorming on like for parenting things, right? Like, what are some good ways I can respond to my son when he asks me this, right? And so I feel like it can be useful for so many things as long as you're always really critical of its output, and you don't let it step in and take the place of your brain, right?
It's a fabulous place to end. And I just want to remind people that the CHRO program begins on April the 8th. It's a 6-month program, and it's for senior executives with an average of 20 years experience. And you have year-long access to over 2,000 courses. You get peer coaching and feedback, regular assessments. It's a small cohort for impactful learning, covering topics such as strategy, leveraging data and analytics for decision making, HR alignment, AR strategy, obviously, some of the things that are happening with work, using diagnosing workplace conflict, etc., as well as dealing with change and managing complexity in the world of AI. Professor, thank you so much for your time today, and I want to thank everyone on the call for some of the thoughtful questions that you asked. And we will be obviously recording this, and you'll have access to it. We look forward to actually seeing you in the program. Thank you so much, Professor.
You're welcome. This was great.